I am Rana Dayıoğlu Erul from Ankara Hacı Bayram Veli University from Turkey. My topic is about tax compliance and the title of my study is Voluntary versus Enforced Tax Compliance, the Slippery Slope Framework. First, I'd like to mention about the plan of the presentation. First of all, I will talk about the determination of the tax compliance and the slippery slope framework, then the features of the slippery slope framework. Then I will talk about the determinants of tax compliance and the slippery slope framework. And finally, I will talk about the results of the analysis of the slippery slope framework, which I applied for survey in this study. I would like to start determining tax compliance. Tax compliance involves being aware of the taxpayer's non-resistance to tax, their acceptance of tax, and their compliance in paying the tax. So tax compliance is classified into two categories, which are voluntary tax compliance and enforced tax compliance. The first one is the voluntary compliance, and it means that taxpayers' willingness to pay taxes because of the reasons such as tax awareness and tax moral, positive attitudes towards taxes, and the relationship between taxpayers and tax authorities. On the other hand, enforced compliance is the obedience of taxpayers to taxes because of the deterrent factors, such as deterrent tax penalties, effective tax audits, extraordinary situations such as wars, and the practices of the tax administration. In other words, taxpayers who do not act in compliance with the tax have to comply with the tax due to these compelling factors. And the hypothesis of the slippery slope framework examines tax compliance on the basis of taxpayer and the authority relations. So in short, the theory focuses on the relationship between taxpayer and the tax administration. In this chart, we can see the theories of tax compliance. These theories examine the economic, social, and psychological variables of tax compliance. For instance, the first theory from Allingham and Sandma in 1972 examines the economic determinants of tax compliance, while prospect theory focuses on cultural, social, and psychological factors. And the other three theories that are tax compliance behavior model, the slippery slope framework, and fiscal connection and optimal tax compliance model, check all the psychological variables, and one of them is the slippery slope framework. So this figure is important for understanding the slippery slope framework among all compliance theories. Here we may see the details of the slippery slope framework. When trust and cooperation between the parties is ensured, trust in authorities and power of trust in authorities will be high, and voluntary tax compliance will also be high. And when power of authorities is high, the taxpayer will obey the tax. In other words, enforced tax compliance will be high this time. However, since the regulations of the tax authority may steer the taxpayers to the slippery slope is the shaded area which we may see in the figure, by directing the taxpayers to tax evasion. And it is necessary to increase the voluntary tax compliance by establishing an environment of trust in the taxpayer relations with the taxpayer. Therefore, the slippery slope model, power of authorities, in a sense increases enforced tax compliance, and trust in authorities increases voluntary tax compliance. In short, the slippery slope framework hypothesis is trust in authorities and power of authorities explain tax compliance, and these two variables are the main variables and the main assumptions of the slippery slope framework. According to the basic assumptions of the slippery slope framework, both power of authorities and trust in authorities have a positive effect on the level of tax compliance. So the purpose of this study is testing these main assumptions of this theory for Turkey. In this table, we can see the international literature about the slippery slope framework. There are many studies for international literature, but a few studies for Turkey. So it can be said that this study may close the gap about this theory in Turkey. In these studies, there are different methods are used, such as experimental method, survey, linear regression method, structural equation model, and panel data analysis. Trust in authorities, power of authorities, voluntary tax compliance, and enforced tax compliance are the main variables in all the studies. And in some studies, some social, cultural, and psychological factors are added in the studies, such as perception of justice, social norms, age, gender, education, and income level. And nearly in all the studies, the main assumptions of the slippery slope framework are confirmed. If we come to the method and sample, first I would like to say that an imaginary country of life was created as a country located at the same place and size as Turkey. And the characteristics of this country were distributed to taxpayers with 4 scenarios, such as low trust, low power, low trust, high power, high trust, high power, and high trust, low power. And it's expected that taxpayers imagine that they are a citizen of the country of life. For instance, in the case of low trust, trust in authorities in the country of life is low, and the authorities do not show a taxpayer-oriented approach. In the high trust model, it's stated that trust in the authorities is high due to the taxpayer-oriented approaches of the authorities. On the other hand, in low power models, the authority is insufficient to detect tax evasion and tax audits are ineffective, tax audit rates are very low and tax penalties are not heavy enough. And in high power situation, it's stated that the authority has an effective power to detect the tax evasion. And the method is survey. I applied for face-to-face interviews to take more effective results. And the sample is chosen self-employed people, 240 taxpayers. Because self-employed people have easier opportunities to make tax evasion if we compare to workers or wage earners. And the questions asked to be answered by the participants started with demographic variables such as gender, age, graduation status, professional experience, and monthly income level. And these questions are classified into some categories. And then the variables of trust in authorities and power of authorities are divided into 2 as voluntary and enforced compliance and directed to participants in an increasing scale from 1 to 7. Here we may see the variables of the study. We have 2 dependent and 2 independent variables. Voluntary tax compliance and enforced tax compliance are dependent variables, and trust in authorities and power of authorities are independent variables. And we have, for example, 3 questions, both 3 questions to reflect voluntary compliance and enforced compliance. For example, the questions are like that: in the land of life, I willingly pay my taxes. paying taxes in life is a moral responsibility that must be voluntarily accepted by all citizens. To pay my tax provides an advantage for all citizens. These three questions reflect the voluntary compliance, and we have 10 questions total to reflect the other all variables. Here in this chart, we may see the multivariate test results. In the analysis of data obtained in line with the survey results, the MANOVA test was applied because there was more than one dependent variable. The multivariate test result table gives information about whether the model is generally or completely meaningful or not. In low trust, low power scenario, the independent variable of trust 2, power 1 and power 2 have a significant effect on voluntary and enforced tax compliance variables. And these effects are 59, 74 and 76%. In the second scenario, which is low trust and high power, the dependent variable of trust 1 has a significant effect on the dependent variables of both. The effect is 51%. In the third scenario, which is high trust and high power, all the dependent variables have significant and meaningful effects on the independent variables. And in the last scenario, except for trust 2 variable, all the variables have positive and meaningful effects on tax compliance variables. This table shows the impact test results for the low trust, low power scenario, which is the first scenario. Accordingly, the power 1 and power 2 independent variables have a significant effect on the enforced tax compliance dependent variable. And these effects are 70% and 77%. Therefore, in cases where both the trust in authorities and the power of authorities are low, the variables representing the trust have no effect on tax compliance, and the effects of power are more dominant. This table shows the impact test results for the low trust and high power scenario. This is the second scenario. According to the test results, the independent variable of trust 1 has a significant effect on dependent variable of voluntary tax compliance, and the effect is 69%. In this scenario, since the power is high, it's expected that the power variables will affect the enforced tax compliance, but the independent variables did not have any effect on the enforced compliance. On the contrary, the variable of trust increased voluntary compliance. This result may be explained by the thought of Wenzel in 2003 within the framework of the concept of punitive justice, that an increase in power will also increase trust. This means that the interaction between the trust in authorities and power of authorities variable can increase tax compliance. So, in short, the relationship between trust in authorities and power of authorities variables are important. On the other hand, taxpayers' perceptions of tax, their perspectives on taxation policies, tax moral and tax awareness, and education level may also be considered as factors affecting this result. If we have a look at the results of scenario 3, which is high trust and high power, it may be said that all the variables have significant and important effects on voluntary and enforced tax compliance. Only trust 1 variable does not have any effect on enforced tax compliance. It may be stated that voluntary compliance and trust factor come to the fore in this scenario, where both trust and power are high, since even the power variables that are expected to affect the enforced tax compliance more strongly affect the voluntary compliance. And if we have a look at the values, the effects on voluntary compliance are 96 and 98%. And this is the results of the last scenario. We can see that trust 1, power 1, and power 2 variables have significant effects on the compliance variables. While the independent variable of trust 1 has a significant effect on both dependent variables, trust 2 does not have a significant effect. And if we have a look at the values, the highest values are on enforced text compliance, that is 60%, and voluntary text compliance, this is 69%. We may say that, as stated by Kirchler, Hoels, and Wahl in 2008, since citizens will show the highest voluntary compliance when trust is the highest level, like in this scenario, the changes in power are insignificant, and the effect of power variables on enforced text compliance is insignificant or low, as seen in this table. And we can see here the last analysis in this analysis for this study. This is the similarity of the scenarios with Turkey. Here, 3 questions are asked to the participants about the similarity of the country of life to Turkey, and the questions are about the trust in authorities similarity, the similarity of power of authorities, and the general similarity that includes these 2 variables. Here we can see the results in this chart. Accordingly, it's seen that the scenarios in which trust in authorities and power of authorities are similar to Turkey at the highest level are low trust, high power, scenario 2, and low trust, low power, this is scenario 1, respectively. According to the results of the third question, which deals with both variables and which contains the previous 2 questions, is also scenario 2, low trust, high power scenario. So scenario 2 is evaluated as the scenario which is most similar to the structure of Turkey. Therefore, it may be stated that taxpayers consider that the authority implements policies to direct taxpayers to enforce tax compliance with strict controls, with tax penalties, with effective tax audits, rather than a taxpayer-oriented approach. As a conclusion, it can be said that the interaction between the dependent variables and the independent variables are also important, and this interaction is realized at the highest level in the situation of high trust, high power. This is scenario 3. And in this scenario where both trust and power are high, trust stands out compared to power. And the effect on voluntary tax compliance is also higher. On the other hand, in scenario 1, it is a low trust, low power situation. It's observed that the power factor became prominent in low trust and low power scenario, and the power variable increased enforced tax compliance in accordance with the assumptions of the theory. In scenario 4, it's seen that the effect of voluntary compliance is higher because of high trust, but even in scenario 2, which is low trust, high power, which is based on the assumptions of the opposite of this scenario, although trust is low, voluntary compliance is still found to be prominent. And this situation is explained with the view that the interaction between trust and power variables also affects tax compliance together. To conclude, we may say that the main assumptions of the slippery slope framework are confirmed in this study, and it's seen that while trust variables affect voluntary tax compliance in general, the power variables affect both compliance variables, being more important on enforced tax compliance. And in this context, the findings of Hull analysis generally support the assumptions of the theory. That's all for me. Thank you.